Great. Yeah. It's like Lela said a little bit. It's on one hand it's good to be home. On the other side, there's a lot of anxiety to be speaking in front of this audience. So I hope the psychology, my psychological state is going to be okay. I gave a very generic title because I didn't know until yesterday which of projects I'm going to talk about exactly. I'm going to talk about 3 different projects. 2 of them are under this title, and then I hope I have time for this short but I think very neat, cool kind of projects, which I would also love to hear feedback. All of them are unpublished, once submitted to be submitted any day now, I hope. So I'll try to go fast, and I apologize for that. I noticed something that if you go to a physics or mathematics department, then they ask questions during the talk, but you're not limited by 50 minutes or an hour, and it can take up to 2 hours. In neuroscience, you're limited, or in biology, you're limited by 50 minutes to an hour, but they're still allowed to ask questions in the middle. So since I have a lot of material to cover, you have to choose. No questions, or you're going to sit here for an hour and a half at least. So pick up your choice, what question is really important for you and which is less. I do want to try and get to this, and we'll see how it goes, because I think it's a really nice project. Okay, so my main work is on the amygdala and combined with the anterior cingulate cortex, part of the prefrontal cortex. One sort of thing about the amygdala is that it is highly evolved, especially its basolateral complex across species. So you can see its relative size in a rat, cat, monkey, and then in a human. It's evolved across evolution. It underlies emotions and emotional learning. It forms a reciprocal one synapse network with the cingulate, mainly with the medial prefrontal cortex, with the anterior cingulate cortex specifically. So that's why I'm working in this network. And another thing besides emotional and emotional learning is that it shows abnormal activity in almost all psychiatric conditions, and mainly in anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. So in the lab we do a lot of work trying to build different models for notice, Yossi, I noticed you. You cannot sneak in behind them. Sorry. Okay. So we look at models and how models of learning can, on the extreme, go to anxiety and post-trauma. So one model is overgeneralization. We published several papers about that. Another model is what leads to stability of aversive memories. I can tell you that the one thing common to both models is that the connectivity between the amygdala and the cingulate cortex is important. This is all published work, so I'm not going to focus on this today, but I'm going to focus on a question that started to interest us I think 2 or 3 years ago, and that what is actually happening between the trials in the paradigm we use, that is of emotional learning. And the paradigm we use is a very simple one. We've been using that for years. There's spontaneous breathing. A tone can come up any random time, usually every 30 to 50 seconds, and the tone predicts the delivery of an aversive odor. In this case, it's a highly aversive odor. The response, the UR, is actually always to this odor a reduction in breathing, in the spontaneous breathing, and the conditioned response is an increase in the breathing, and that's fine. Again, we published a lot of work showing what are the neural responses to during learning in this particular paradigm. It's a very nice paradigm for emotional learning in primates due to many confounds and due to the intrinsic anatomical connectivity between the olfactory system, and the amygdala. But in this paradigm, we also allow approximately 25 to 50 seconds of an intertrial interval, time between the trials, between the appearance of one CS, between the end of the US and the appearance of the second CS. This was originally due to several reasons, but we started asking what actually happens between the trials. And so if you look behaviorally during the trials, then really nothing is happening. And that shouldn't be surprising because the CS is actually a good predictor for the US. So the animal has no reason to do anything. First, this is random, this time is random. Second, it can wait till the CS and then do the preparatory response it needs. So it's a good predictor. So if we look both, this is just a measure of several trials, and the spontaneous breathing, 30 seconds before the CS. It's aligned to the CS to show that there's no preparatory response. This is actually the root mean square of the response. You can see this is in the late trials, there are 30 trials. There's no real difference across the trials. We don't see any increase in the response. If you look at the spectrum, there are actually two lines here, one for mid trials, the other for the late trials. The spectrum looks approximately the same, so there's no increase in inhale as well. So both things we see as the CR response, which is an increase here and sometimes a decrease or an increase in the time between the inhale, we do not see on average on the intertrial interval, and again, there's no reason to expect it to be. If you look at the neural activity, again, these are classical responses to the CS and US. We published a lot about it. You can find hundreds of cells that have differential responses to CS, US, acquire them during learning. This is all published. But if you look, this is one cell activity, rasters and PSVHs for aversive and appetitive stimuli, or for amygdala and cingulate cortex. It actually should be 4 lines here, but it looks exactly the same. You see in many cells quiet activity. If you look on the average activity, this is 30 seconds. Again, you see very little activity towards during the ITI towards the next trial. But on the other hand, if you look at classical cognitive psychology literature, you see that the ITI duration has a lot to do with the learning, and I'm sure many of you are aware of that. The longer the ITI, the intertrial interval, the better is the learning, both the response, the strength of the memory, and the learning rate. There is debate whether it's the actual length of the ITI or the ITI to ISI, intertrial interval ratio to interstimulus interval ratio. Some find it, some less. But what's clear is that we see it here as well. So because we have a very wide range of ITIs, 25 to 50 seconds, we can divide it here. It's divided into several into percentiles. And here you can see the response. This is the length of the ITI at the previous trial. This is the size of the response on the conditioned response on the next trial. And you can see that it increases. If we now look at randomize the actual trial order, then you see nothing. So it has to do with the ITI and not with the order of presentation of the trials. If you do the same thing and look at the learning rate, here there are several ways to quantify learning rate. They're all pretty robust in this paradigm. If you look at the conditioned response in trial N, minus it's the derivative minus the conditioned response in the previous trial as a function of the ITI, then you see again an increase, meaning after a long ITI, the animal increased its response compared to the previous trial. If you order it by the actual trial order, then you get the reverse, which is what you would expect from learning, right? The difference goes less and less until it plateaus, and here there's performance reached at the plateau, so the derivative is 0 and there's no more learning. But if you do it per the length of the ITI, you get an increase in the learning rate. So we see here what have been shown in previous paradigms already 30 years ago in different paradigms. Less inversely, more in positive, but still is that the duration of the ITI actually directly affects within day both the strength of the memory and the learning rate itself. Another could be there are two widespread explanations for it. There's actually one more which maybe I'll get to later on. But one of them is that it's the statistics of the CSU is pairing in the environment. The longer the ITI, the more the CSUS has significance. One can show it statistically. So it is what is the ratio of the ITI duration per the ISI duration. But that means that it requires a representation of long time scales of 30 to 40 seconds, which is a long time scale to represent in neuroscience. There are very few papers, if at all. I think I'm familiar with one, maybe two, that actually show a representation of such long time scale. Definitely not in this system. The other is what some of you might know from basic from the hippocampus, although there it's a different story, is that there's some kind of a memory rehearsal during the ITI, and if you have more time to do memory rehearsal, you might get better learning. But as I showed you, there's no stimulus along the ITI, so it requires some non-stimulus evoked representation. So I'll start with showing this one, then I'll show what we think about this one, and then we can continue. Okay, so single cell duration, a single cell ITI duration. So if I showed you across in one cell and across the whole population, but if you now take example of single cells, so this is a kind of an awkward representation. Maybe I should put it on a linear scale. There's nothing circular here. It's actually minus the trial, the previous trial ITI, current trial, and the ITI. So it's always aligned on a trial. You have to align it on a trial, and you can look on a CSUS, and you can look at the previous ITI and the next ITI. And what you can see in these examples here, it's maybe a little bit more evident, is that here it's in the middle of the ITI, and the bars represent the actual, it's a PSTH. The bar represent the firing rate. You can see that some cells have different preferred coding. Here it's at the end of the ITI. Here it's again, it's more wide and middle toward end, etc., etc. So you can see different modulations of single cell during the ITI. If we try and quantify it significantly, then there are obviously several ways to do it. One way is to shuffle the bins within the ITI, so this is shuffling of bins, and it becomes wider at the end just because we have less trials with ITI of the mean ITI, or of less than the mean ITI. But this is the actual activity, this is the shuffle, standard deviation. So these are 4 examples. Cells have different kind of modulations during the ITI, and just consider mean ITI is approximately 30 to 40 seconds. Although this looks like a few seconds just by scanning, the x-axis here is actually 40 seconds. Okay, so this is actually a widespread over a much longer period. One way to do it, we can take a number of how many cells are significant. I usually prefer to do it at the population level. So here's the way we do it. It's the number of significant ITI duration, percentage of activity, significant ITI duration, a percentage of cells. Just to explain, so 50% of the cells had 20% of the ITI duration significant, that is above 2 standard deviations. The black one would be the null distribution, which is done by shuffling, which is what you would expect. approximately 5% of the cells have 95% of 95% of the cells have 5% significance. So that's standard null distribution, and what you can see is that many more cells have modulation that is beyond chance level during the ITI. If you look at is it related to learning, then the answer is yes. This is the habituation, normalized. Spike RMS is just the RMS of this pair that shuffled. Again, there are several ways to do it. They're all robust. This is so during learning, this is increased. During extinction, which I didn't mention, but extinction is just presenting the CS without the US, then it actually goes back almost to normal. It's still above normal, and there are a lot to say about extinction in other papers, which I'm not dealing with here. But you can see it has to do with learning and not just any kind of stimulus-to-stimulus response. So if you just put the CS to CS, then you don't get this kind of modulation. Another thing which is concerned mainly to olfactory people is because our US are odors, then the stay in the receptor is much longer, and so we have 40 seconds. I think we're safe, much beyond what is necessary, but just to be sure, we have catch trials where there's the CS but no US, and you can see overlap the reinforced and the unreinforced trials, and the modulation again, this is 30 to 40 seconds, looks exactly the same. You can see the number of spike RMS in this case in reinforced and in unreinforced trials. Extinction goes down. So we have a modulation that is due to learning, not due to the reinforced, not due to the odor itself. Another thing that we noticed, and we actually spent a lot of time looking for that, is that does it change based on the recent ITI modulation? If this is indeed a representation of the ITI and the ITI changes, and that determines strength of learning, then maybe the cell should change its activity. We did find that it's highly significant in 20% of the cells. So here you can see the previous trial ITI and the center of the mass, approximately where is the peak of the activity in the next trial ITI. And here I'm showing some 3 robust examples. So there, in 20% of the cell, the previous trial ITI actually affected where is the cell going to be modulated in the next intertrial interval. Again, there's no external stimulus, and it's approximately 25 to 50 seconds modulation. And we tried to go, I was hoping to see actually the cell averaging over a few trials back. That wasn't the case. If you go back and either look at n-2, n-3, or build a combined model of n steps back, the only factor that comes out is n-1. So the only history the cell cares about is the previous trial ITI, and not, at least in most of the cells. This is a different kind of modulation. Just means that the longer the ITI was, the higher was the stronger was the modulation. We can skip it for now. Now, if we look at the peak modulation, where is it across the ITI, in the amygdala and in the ACC, we see something interesting. So this is the distribution of peak activity of all amygdala cells. This is probably due to the US itself, the activity here. But other than that, it seems like there's a middle modulation. Most cells modulate in the middle, whereas here most cells modulate right after. There's no US locked activity, but most cells modulate early in the ITI or late in the ITI. That's the difference between the distributions. So actually, it's a non-homogeneous in each of them, but if you combine them together, you get a homogeneous representation of the whole time during the ITI. Yes? Yeah, so there are 2 ways to do that. Either to take the mean ITI, for this we warp time. I mean, you can take the mean ITI and warp across it. Yeah. To it. Yeah, to it. That shows the tuning width again, beside the corners, which is always hard to see. It seems like hard to know if it's due to the actual sampling or something real. It actually looks like there's no difference, and there's actually pretty wide tuning of 10. This is half width at half height. Pretty wide tuning of cells during the ITI. Okay, the next thing we did is, because we had amygdala cingulate together, recorded together, we looked at whether there's any synchronous activity, and the answer is yes. And just to go over it quickly, so this is basically the time in the ITI, again from 0 to the mean of the ITI, and this is actually standard cross correlation between two cells recorded simultaneously in the amygdala and the cingulate. This is all average number of significant beams in all correlations. You can see that you have a modulation early and late. We made sure this is PCA, as you can see by the ring shape here, is not the best approach here, but it still allowed us to differentiate into 3 different populations. It's important because it can be just an average of several that has both early and late, and what it actually is 3 different populations, one with early response synchronization, the other with more spread middle response, and the last is again focused synchronized response. So there are 3 populations, and they kind of match the transition between here, here, and here, if you look at the time that they're synchronized. And as you can expect, it shouldn't be surprising at this point, but if you use any kind of optimal linear readout or even a simpler population vector, it doesn't really matter. You can decode time from this activity if you combine both the cingulate and the amygdala. Otherwise you get a biased representation, but these are just 50 leave one out examples. And this is the mean squared error as a number of neurons we use. It actually plateaus at 3 and doesn't go down much more, which means something about the accuracy of the decoding. Obviously, if we average, we get a good representation of time up to, so this is real time, this is real time, this is the estimated reconstructed time. We can get a pretty good reconstruction of the ITI, again up to few seconds. So it's not a representation at a second or sub-second resolution, it's a few second resolution of representation combined in the amygdala and in the cingulate. So I'll summarize this first part. So cingulate cells signal early and late phases in the intertrial interval, whereas amygdala cells signal the mid phase. Coupled amygdala increase during transition phases, so it seems like there's activity in the cingulate transferring to the amygdala and then go back to the cingulate. It's also in line with several other proposals in cognitive psychology. Some of you are familiar with the opponent process theory, where there's a relief process that allows you to get out of the dangerous situation. So this is kind of a safety representation, and these are more anxiety-like representations. And what is mostly novel here is that the network, actually the combined network here, maintains temporal contingencies at the order of dozens of seconds, which, as far as I know, was not shown. Was shown. There's one paper for the striatum at the population level, but usually representation is from much shorter time scales. So that's one thing. Yeah.
One thing I don't understand is, let's say that I'm a neuron that I'm selective to approximately the middle of the ITI. How do I know when to fire? Like if you walk all the time, so, and the neuron knows to fire exactly in the middle, it knows how to predict the future.
No, it knows when it began, basically. That's enough. If it can count time from when it began, that should be enough, right? What? In an unwarp situation.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, warp here is done just to allow comparison. It looks the same in warp and unwarp. I think it's a good question. So I don't have a good answer. Why?
Need to measure absolute time, not relative time. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, our assumption is that measure absolute time from the end of the last US. It doesn't measure, a neuron in the middle doesn't measure absolute time. The whole population accumulated can measure the whole time. That is basically what you can derive from this. My conclusion from here is not that you can know where exactly in the ITI is. I mean, it shows that the principle, but for the purpose of our interpretation, it shows that the network knows how much time the ITI is. I agree that if you show that in warped, then the question may. But we did warping just for allow comparison. If you do it in our warp, it looks exactly the same. Okay, so.
Okay, just a clarification question.
Yeah.
So when exactly you look at the activity of the network? I mean, trivially, if the network fires at a constant rate, then just like counting spikes, where you are in time.
You what?
I'm a bit confused about this according to time. When exactly do you look at the activity? Because trivially, if the network is firing at a constant rate, and by counting time, you can know the counting spikes, you know the time, integrating spikes, you know the time.
Assuming the network has, assuming the spikes are reliable from time to time.
No, just assuming what's on.
No, because if you here, all I take is the location of the peak of the cell, and I do a leave one, and I do a validation process. So just counting spikes will not help you here.
So maybe, yeah. I guess I didn't exactly understand what do you mean by reconstructed time?
So for reconstruct, and I said we can do it with population vector as well. So reconstructed time, just take if you do it with the population vector, if you do it with the optimal linear driven, but you just take the peak tuning of the cell, and you reconstruct it just like you do with the population vector.
On which one window of time you measure the activity when you...
Well, it has to be done in beans, right? In some beaning. So the bean size here is 40 beans in almost all I show you. We tried it in 40, 20, 10 beans.
What? 10 seconds?
No, beans.
90.
Of
It's 90.
So what is the size of the bean?
The largest one is 9 seconds.
it ranges between if you all align it to the mean if you take the mean ITI, which is 40 seconds, then 40 beans is 1 second, right?
So you reconstruct it from, let's say, 1 second to 2 seconds.
Yeah.
In real time or in scale time?
In real time here. Again, for presentation, it's sometimes warp time just because it's easier, but the calculations are done on real time here.
How can you even present the warp time? Why does it make sense? No,
Just to compare across different, just to show across, it depends where, here you see the actual time, right? This is the actual time. So sometimes here you need to compare, if you want to scale the activity, then you need to...
You need to compare seconds, not compare...
No, this is unwarped, so I don't remember. Some of them is warped, some is unwarped. I think most of them is unwarped, and if you do it in warp time, it stays exactly the same. Which I agree with your comment that in warp time, it would induce a different question. But this is done on the mean ITI, on unwarped time. And you can actually see here the actual time in each trial. Same as here. This is not warped. This is the time in the ITI. And that's why we stopped at 30, just because we cannot go beyond it. The data goes away. Okay, so the second thing, so there's a representation of long time scales of 30 to 50 seconds in the amygdala cingulate, and it's done combined. I didn't show you, but if you use only one of them, you get a biased representation. You can see it based on these two preferred peaks. Okay, so the next project is a little bit different, but it's going to look approximately at a different angle of the question. What happens during the ITI if there is no activity, or at least no average activity, no stimulus-evoked activity that we're used to? So this problem is a little bit different. We use discriminatory learning. So one stimulus predicts an aversive odor, the other predicts a pleasant odor. The animal learns to discriminate them pretty nicely within 5 to 10 trials. Again, we showed that in several previous papers, but the ITI remains the same, randomized across different trials and with the long range. So we ask, could there be something in the ITI that we are that we can observe that could be interesting? And we tried starting to look at, obviously based on some literature, most of it is hippocampal, but there are very few attempts at other conditioning, which I think most of them have failed, at looking at CS and US repeated representations during the ITI. That has failed completely. It's impossible to find it, at least in our data. And we thought of one way to see if there's anything interesting in the code, and that comes from, I would say, 2 or 3 different questions together. One is, are there temporal sequences that we can look at during the ITI that has any meaning? And the way we do it is very straightforward. We just build a distribution of, we take 3 spikes. Everything I'm going to tell you is about 3 recorded spikes simultaneous, 3 recorded neurons simultaneously from the amygdala. And we build a distribution just by every time we see a spike, we can call it 1, 1, 2, right? It's 1, 1, 2. Then the next one is 1, 2, 3. Should be 1, 2, 3. 2, 2, 2 is going to should be the next one. Anyway, but that is how we build the distribution all across. If we do that across different time windows, then that's the number of triplets we get. A priori, we decided on 150 millisecond windows. We can discuss the size of the window later and how it changes the results. And I mean, what is the optimal time for a triplet sequence? So this is 150 milliseconds, and we can build a distribution of how much we had during the ITI each of the possible combinations. And then we can ask several questions if you want to convince ourselves that they actually matter. So one is, do they expect beyond fine weight modulations that have been attempted by many? I'll show you one thing about it. We think we can convince ourselves that there is, but it's not. I think it's not going to be enough. The other is it consistent across trials? So if sequences do have any meaning, then they should be consistent across different trials in the intertrial interval. Lastly, are they consistent across valence? If they have anything to do with the learning and the memory, then they should be consistent across the discriminatory learning, and do they hold information about the valence? That's going to be kind of tightly related to this. So obviously, to compare distribution, so what we do is just build distributions during the intertrial interval and just compare them by Jensen-Shannon divergence. I'm not going to explain too much, but it's a nice metric for comparing distributions. And what we do is circular shuffle on the data, and we compare the actual distribution of the data. Imagine that on the x-axis you have all combinations like here. So this is the actual distribution.
How are they ordered?
The order is in this case limited to 150 milliseconds.
In the x-axis, not here.
Yes, but they are ordered like
Here?
No, here they are going down. I understand. Here they are monocyclic. Here they are pentatonic.
Here?
There's some ordering of
All of them. Oh, the ordering is by the. Here there's no ordering. The order is just this. In this case, this is an example. You'll see in a second the order. So here it's not ordered by anything specific. So this is the real data. This is the shuffle data, and I think circular shuffle. Just take one of the neurons and shift them, and another one and shift them.
So shift them to the next trial.
It's a circular shuffle.
Yeah.
No, it's an ITI. It's a circular shuffle. So we don't shift to the next trial. Just shift within the ITI.
Can you show on the previous figure?
So what?
What do you mean by shuffling? On the
So it's just taking this part and putting it here and moving everything. Yeah, look at it here, and then it makes sense. Okay? We play with many kinds of shuffling. Shuffling is always cancel out. How do you say cancel out? But behind, yeah. Yeah, and circular shuffle is circular. I mean, you know, I'm not. I grew up here, so I know. But that I'll say something about it in a second. And circular shuffle seems to be the best way to do it, at least in this case. Not the best result. We can get much better result if you do a different kind of shuffle. But circular shuffle seems to be the right thing to do here. Okay, so here's a question. So this is arranged differently. Chaim, this is arranged from highest to lowest in the shuffle data, and obviously the actual data is arranged accordingly to the shuffle. So you can see this is on a log scale, this is on linear scale again, log scale, linear scale, log scale, linear scale. And we can ask what is the difference between the data to the shuffled and shuffle to the shuffle, and just see that it looks different, and sometimes it is different. In these two examples, sometimes it is less different. If we look at the number of neurons that cross this first criteria, then there's a huge number, 40 or so triplets. This is if it's done on different electrodes in case someone is suspicious of spike sorting. So this is different electrodes. You still get a very robust phenomena. And the control here is just taking neurons from different days and doing the same thing.
But if you have some weak modulation within a trial with overall fine range, then this would be consistent with this result, no?
Sweep modulation of what?
Overall fine rate within a trial, slight increase, slight decrease. Then with circular shuffling, we give you different results in this scenario.
A sweep modulation of fine rate. I'm not convinced, but I trust you. It will give me the same result as here. No, we don't have Swift. I mean, definitely not in most neurons. You can claim that maybe in 40% of the neurons we do have, but then you would see it here. But 40% don't have this kind of. It has to be in all three neurons.
No, it's yeah, it's slight.
Yeah.
So
The-
only modulation to.
Yeah, but that again, there's no modulation across the
This is the average
IT.
across trials,
Yes,
and the statistics are done within trials. So if we
statistics
see
are done
certain
within
trials,
trials.
the neuron would have some sort of temporal modulation. Okay, go
If
ahead.
if a neuron, if a neuron has significant changes in firing rate that are fixed compared to the other two neurons, then by definition you would get a triplet if they are within 150 milliseconds. That's right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
But again, the point here is that it's not stimulus locked. If I would show it post to CS, it would be even harder. This is to convince. This is across 30 seconds of recorded across the Okay. So one more thing to do is that may be related to one question here, is that what I showed you till now, shuffling in one, shows that it's a triplet, but doesn't show it goes beyond pairwise activity. So if we now shuffle all combinations and compare against all combinations and see which triplet passes all three shuffling, all three circular shuffling, then we still get a robust 40%. So this, almost by definition, says that it's a structure in the triplet that goes beyond pairwise structure correlations. And this is across different electrodes. It's still 15%, much higher than chance. Okay, another test, and I, as I said earlier, I completely agree. Shuffle is always a very beehive, as you said. So one more, there are two more things we thought could convince us. One is to see is it consistent across trials, across different trials. So you just take the 30 trials, you take 15 trials randomly, you take another 15 trials randomly, and compare the distribution between the two. And then another resample and do it again. And so that's what we show here. We do it several times, 100 times in this case. And you compare, in this case, you actually expect the other way around, which is that the difference between the two actual data points, one from 15 trials, the other from other 15 trials, would be closer than the shuffle from this and the shuffle from the and the data from the other shuffle, and vice versa. And this is what you see here. Again, the same result. So sequences are consistent, and again, they're going beyond pairwise activity if you do all single shuffles for all three options and compare against all three. So these are triplets that were compared twice against the two options of shuffling. Okay, and this just shows that the temporal domain, and there's nothing really important here besides the fact that it rises at 25 to 50 milliseconds, maybe get some maximum at 100 milliseconds, maybe saying the temporal sequences occur somewhere in this range. Yeah, this shows the difference between electrodes, showing that closer electrodes have a higher tendency of showing more sequences across different electrodes, obviously. Okay, the last thing, again, to convince that sequences have anything to do with what was actually going on in the task, and not just beyond chance, is to show that they are consistent across valence, following an aversive or an appetitive US. So you see here the different trials. It's obviously very hard to see differences in the distribution if you compare the colors here, but they exist. So this is one example, this is another example, and what we thought about comparing is just a JSD from aversive to aversive in different trials, obviously. So two different trials of aversive and aversive, two sets of different trials, and JSD between aversive, doesn't matter one of them, and a set of pleasant trials, and the same thing between pleasant and pleasant, and aversive and pleasant. And as you can see, several triplets many triplets are closer are closer between the same valence than they are between different valences. And again, this is not a US response, this is the ITI. A few good seconds after the valence has already left the receptors, and it's also true for unreinforced trials, as I showed you before. This just shows the statistics across the control, so there's nothing if you take different neurons from different days. So it's not just a response to by the way, the aversive order was the same across days, so it's not a SWIP response or something to a general aversive order altogether. So within day and across day, you see that there's a consistency across valence. So this should not surprise you for the next slide. This just shows that in the amygdala, in both cases, you get much more sequences than you get in the cingulate cortex, maybe pointing to its role in valence conditioning and coding. But just shows the proportion of significant triplets in the amygdala and in the cingulate for both kinds of the ways we did it. Okay, so the previous slide, this slide shouldn't surprise you then that we can now decode valence based on it, and what we do is take either the actual distribution, the two distribution, do a maximum likelihood comparison. On a triplet is 3 neurons, and so we take either the 3 fine-rate modulations. Here we actually show that we take the 3 ISI, just if there's any, and this I think answer your question also. ISI should have some shape in the cases mentioned, and we do the maximum likelihood over 3 of them, and just try to categorize to classify pleasant or aversive. So you see the triplets have the percentage of triplets that had a significant classification was pretty high. Cross days was a chance. Different electrodes was again high. Cross days was a chance. If we now look at the proportion of, so this is just the number of significant classification. It could be significant at 65% correct, but this is the percentage of correct classification across ordered from best triplet to worst triplet. Across all triplets, we go only to 0.3 here. You can see all of it. And what we compare here is the sequences versus either the ISI coding, so we decode the valence based on the ISI, or based on the firing rate taken from the ITI. You can do it in different ways. You can take the PCA of the firing rate or the whole distribution of the firing rate. It actually doesn't matter.
This is for 3 neurons again?
For neurons.
No, 3 neurons?
3 neurons. Always, everything I'm saying from the beginning is about 3 neurons together.
So what do you mean by the best triplet?
The best triplet is just the triplet from which I was able to classify best, pleasant or aversive. Sorry? For the distribution of sequences in a given 3 neurons. Okay? And what you can see is surprising or not, that depends on what you think about the brain, is that if you look on average and take everything, then firing rate always wins at the end if you average over across the whole population. If you somehow know to choose the 10% best neurons, you would be much better at looking at the temporal sequences of the triplets. Sorry? So, I'm kind of surprised always of getting this remark. I don't know I don't know if identifying something correctly, especially aversive, by 85 versus 80 is a lot or not.
What about 80 and 81?
That,
80 and 80
that's a very valid point. No, it's a valid point, and I think it's actually a good point. No, it's a good point for discussion,
I know, but
because many of the studies show a difference, explain variance by 2-3%. Now, is that a lot or not? And I can just give you an example for the. I'm not so sure. So I can give you an example for the motor skills. So Donoghue, for example, tried for years doing that. I disagree.
where do you stop?
What do you mean?
So, if you had 0.8 and 0.801, so where do you stop?
So neuroscience usually stops at significant, which I agree is a mistake. No, I completely agree with you. Stopping at significant is not scientific. Wait a second, Chaim. I'm saying what you're saying. Significant is not so interesting. So to me, more interesting is that 85 versus 80, especially in aversive versus pleasant, is a big difference.
Too big, you mean, for your life experience?
For survival rate. Okay? I mean, that's how evolution works, right? If 85% of one kind of zebra identify a lion more rigorously than another, and the other kind of zebra identify 90%, in the simplest model of evolution, I can show you this will win over this, right? Yeah, wait, do you agree with this?
Smaller than that will also be.
Maybe.
But maybe, yes.
Okay.
But maybe you don't have the quantitative model.
I agree.
That's a story.
I agree. But for me, 85 versus 80 in 10% of the neurons is a completely robust result. Not only significant, even robust. Okay. And if you do that across day triplets, then you can see that this is not the case, which means that means that there is information about valence in the fine grade, because this is done in the same way, right? Triplets of neurons, but taking only the fine grade, but the sequences, obviously, when you scramble them, do not get to the nice result. Okay, this just shows that what I told you, that if you look across time, across 25 seconds in the ITI, the significant proportion and the hit rate remains approximately the same. So again, it's not US related, it's not auto related per se. Okay, so interest summary 2. What time is it now? Oh my God. I have to get to the next one because it's going to upset Chaim even more, so I just have to. Okay, so interim sequences exist in the pyramid amygdala and hold information about violent discrimination during long intervals after the stimuli. I mean, I cannot emphasize it more. I don't know how much of you thought about it, but this is 30 to 40 seconds after the stimulus is long gone, and the information is still there about valence.
You use the entire period, right? You don't choose the period after 30 seconds.
Yeah, but here it's done in sliding windows of 3 seconds.
So it's in 3 seconds, not 30.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that sequences, even here, in those 3 seconds, are meaningful. Yeah. Okay, a small subset, 10%, provides more information than fine grade temporal structure of single cells, because use ISI and firing rate and compare this against pairwise, etc. And I didn't show it to you, but if we try to compare D prime of neurons versus behavior, you get much better. Now this was shown many years ago by, I think Newsom was the first to show it, and maybe I think it was your paper, one of the first in 90 something, but they showed that even one neuron can do better than behavior, but we show here that it can do as well much better than behavior. And
What's the behavior exactly?
the behavior, okay, so as always in behavior, you have to add the cautious note to the best that we can measure. Behavior is always to the best that we can measure. I think that should be put in all neuroscience papers. But the behavior here is how much is the CR condition response, how our breathing changes, and you can play with different measures, either the area under the curve or the time between them. But yeah, it's the proportion. Okay, so I don't know if it's a rehearsal of memory or not. It's still hard to interpret, but we do see three interesting things. First, there's valence-related information that is coded in sequences and in triplets that go beyond pairwise activity in their temporal position. Okay, so I'll try and go over it briefly. This is something I've been dreaming to do some time ago, and I saw you have soon a conference called the Human something, the Human Advantage Benefit. What makes us human? I saw the list of speakers. I doubt they're going to say exactly that, but let's continue and see. So that I've been dreaming to do that for a few years now, and it's actually pretty easy, and it's kind of an opportunistic investigation for the simple reason. We're recording the amygdala cingulate cortex for my own reasons, which I explain, and Itzhak Fried, which I think most of you know, records in epileptic patients, and therefore he almost always have electrodes in the cingulate cortex and the amygdala, which for a reason nobody really knows are a major risk to be an epileptic loci. So it just by coincidence, if you want, by nature coincidence, that we have data from similar regions. And I just wanted to compare. So here's the motivation. I'm going to be a little bit, not hand-waving, but popular here just for the motivation. Then we'll go to the data. So usually when you think about the human advantage, you focus on the relative. The best answer, I think, across the literature now, is the increased number of neurons in prefrontal regions. That, I think, is the canonical answer we get if you look at most of the literature. So that goes to maybe the implementation, the hardware kind of level, and I would say it's well balanced by psychopathologies, the human advantage. I don't know, maybe monkeys have PTSD and anxiety as well. We definitely try to do models, but I dare to say humans have more of this kind of psychopathologies. So another similar, in my view, analog is that if you look at the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, then the former was kind of evolved to underlie robust, reliable survival skills, and more than the analogs, threats, emotions, etc. The prefrontal to underlie, let's say, more flexible learning, complex tasks. And so we wanted to ask, given that we had the data, can we say something about the differences between human and non-human primates, and the difference between amygdala and prefrontal cortex? And the hypothesis was that the difference should actually be similar. So is the analogy clear? It's a motivation. So don't.
Between areas.
Yes, the difference between amygdala and prefrontal should be in the same direction as the difference between non-human primates and primates. And an even stronger hypothesis is that within human, this difference should be the same as within a monkey, and the other way around, within amygdala, this difference should be as within the prefrontal cortex. So we have kind of a 2-by-2 comparison here. So how does one compare it? So we have 7 humans doing 2 different tasks, which let's delay the discussion about which task, which I'm sure everyone wants to ask till the end, but there are 2 different reach tasks that the humans do, and we have 5 animals doing 3 different tasks. All I can say for now is that both tasks are highly engaging. There are no chances of anyone not being engaged during the tasks, the animals or the humans. And also important is there are different tasks here and different tasks within species. So we have a variety of tasks across to see that our result is robust. So here's the way we do it in the most straightforward way. We want to call something richness, and the way we call richness here is does the neuron exploit the potential vocabulary? So we just take long period of recordings, completely ignore the task. We'll talk about the task later, and just calculate the entropy in different combinations. So we have 5 different combinations. Each letter can be of these milliseconds. We consider it whether there was or there was the spike in it. And this goes into 4 words, 8 words, or 16 words. So altogether we have 15 combinations. And just notice that they span 4 to 260 milliseconds. So we have also a wide range of temporal domain. Again, this will show robustness in the results. So one thing about entropy, which I think most of you are familiar with, is that by definition it goes very nicely with firing rate. So how do we compare across regions, and how do we actually ask how much is the neuron actually exploiting out of its potential firing rate? So this shows just for one example. This shows for another example of bean and of combination of bean and letter. Of letter and word. And this is the analytical maximal entropy, which we can easily derive. And this is the actual neuron with the same firing rate. So for each neuron, we can take a firing rate, the average firing rate of the neuron, and calculate the analytical maximal entropy for that neuron. And so you can see it here in an inset. So although it looks, obviously it goes with the firing rate, there are actually big differences. And again, Chaim, you can argue how much big is big, but I think this is pretty convincing that there's a difference between the maximal entropy and how much the neuron is actually using out of its average firing rate. So these are 2 examples, and these are 2 just examples of what would a analytical maximal entropy neuron look like. This is the distribution, the triangles of each word for the maximal analytical entropy, and this is the actual data for one neuron. So this is one with low, this is one with high, and etc. So what we basically do is just calculate the contrast entropy, which is the actual entropy divided by the analytical maximal entropy of a neuron with the same firing rate. And we're going to call that contrast entropy. What it does basically, we now look at the correlation between the firing rate and the contrast entropy, then there's no correlation. This is for the same 2 cases, and this is the drop in correlation for all 15 cases. So they were all obviously high before, as you can see here, but after we use the contrast entropy, they all drop to approximately 0 correlation with firing rate. So we now have a way to compare different neurons and different regions, and how the neurons in this region actually exploit their firing rate for different words, to use entropy. So this is the main result, richness in humans and prefrontal cortex. It shouldn't surprise you based on the motivation. The monkey amygdala had the lowest contrast entropy, then the monkey cingulate cortex, then the human amygdala, then the human cingulate cortex, and I just hope my Aya cook is not going to see this picture after it's published, because then we're going to get more arguments why we shouldn't use a private joke. I think you got it. Okay, so here's all 4 comparisons that are relevant. I don't want to think of it as a hierarchy, because what actually mattered for me is the 2-by-2 comparisons. So within amygdala, human amygdala was always higher than monkey amygdala. Within cingulate, human cingulate was always higher than monkey cingulate. This is for all 15 combinations that I showed you before to show its robustness of the results. This is within human, the cingulate was always higher than the amygdala, and within monkey, the cingulate was always higher than the monkey amygdala. Okay, so these are all kind of validations. Fine rate, I learned, especially during my years here, is a very tricky business. I think we do the right thing here in how we define contrast entropy, but just to be on the safe side, we select neurons with similar firing rate, equate neurons with similar firing rate. So here you see just a distribution of selected subpopulations. Here we compare across human and monkeys in both regions, and here we compare across regions within the same. So again, the 2-by-2 comparison. And again, you have, even if you equate firing rate just by that, you get the same result of human amygdala higher than monkey amygdala, human cingulate higher than monkey cingulate, monkey higher than monkey amygdala, human cingulate higher than human amygdala. Okay, in terms of richness. This is done by another method, strong method of calculating the infinite word length for entropy. I'm not going to go into details, some of you know it, but just another method of calculating what might be the real entropy at an infinite word length. And again, we get the same result, letters length in the amygdala, human higher than monkey, in the cingulate, human higher than monkey, in the monkey, cingulate higher than amygdala, in the human, cingulate higher than amygdala as well. This is done in another way of shuffling time windows between tasks. We'll get to that at the end if we have time. Okay, so I have 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes is good. So if you think about firing rate in single neurons, then there are 2 things that could be a trade-off. One is the potential vocabulary, which I just described. The other is the potential, we call it here speed of response, which is actually a definition by Barlow from many years ago. You can think of it as vigor of response. It actually means how much bursty the neurons was. How many spikes did you have in this word, in this specific time period? So if you do a brute force empirical investigation, you take all the words that have 1 spike in them, then you get the same. This is and 1 spike. I have to go back to something. So 1 spike is actually a word that has more frequency in the analytical maximal entropy, and then you get the same kind of order that you got before, going from monkey amygdala, monkey ACC, human amygdala, human cingulate cortex. This is empirical data. If on the other hand, you take how many words you had that had more than 1 spike, which I'm going to call speed of response, because it just for a very simple reason. It's going to be more effective in integration and activating downstream regions or downstream networks. Then you get the inverse picture of now the monkey amygdala is the highest and the human cingulate is the lowest. So there, in the data itself, there is some kind of a trade-off between the potential vocabulary and the potential speed of response or vigor of response. I'm going to call it robustness from now on. I know, I mean, there are different ways to define robustness, but I think for me, you can call it reliability. Maybe it's a better terminology. Now, the only way to increase both of them simultaneously is to increase the firing rate. That's just a given. If you increase the firing rate, you can increase both the potential vocabulary and the vigor of response simultaneously. But we are neurons, and hence we are limited in all kind of metabolic and other constraints. And so we want to ask for a given firing rate, given that the neuron has an overall firing rate that is on average the same, how can you increase one of them? So you cannot increase both of them, but what you can do is by a simple two-state Markov, build a simple two-state Markov neuron that after some, it can easily be shown that it has two free parameters. One is the firing rate, the other is beta, which will just move from 0 to 1 and just determine whether it uses all its entropy or less entropy from 0 to 1. 1 would be the maximal analytical entropy. And this would actually induce an orthogonal space which you can increase the beta across it with equal firing rate, right? We're talking about now neurons with equal firing rate. So if you just by playing with beta, you induce a trade-off between how much you have vigor or speed of response and potential vocabulary, more entropy. So in singular, and this is basically just fitting all our hundreds of actual neurons in all regions, fitting the firing rate is given, fitting the right beta to them, and this is cumulative distribution. It should not be a surprise based on the previous result, but you can see the same order with this model as well, that the trade-off is actually maintained here. So human cingulate, human amygdala, monkey cingulate, monkey amygdala. Now, another one, so that was kind of speed of response or robustness in a single neuron. If we want to see it in pairs of neurons, then we need to look at correlations. So if you look at correlations, then you get, so these are standard pairwise correlations between all the possible opportunities you see here. And again, you see that the pairwise correlations show you the inverse picture of what we saw until now. If we had higher richness in cingulate and in humans, then we have more correlations in firing rate in monkeys and in the amygdala. And that can be seen here for all options, again, for all comparison. You always have more correlations in human amygdala than in human cingulate, monkey amygdala, monkey cingulate, monkey amygdala, human amygdala, and monkey HCC, human HCC. This is done by cross correlations. Another way to see the robustness and the availability to downstream, to effectively modulate downstream neurons, is to show how synchronized the activity is. And if you do that, you get that activity in the amygdala is much more synchronized in the monkey amygdala than in monkey cingulate, than in human amygdala, than in human cingulate. This is done on Jensen channel divergence. We can ignore it for now, but it shows overlapping words, which is the same. So if you want to compare robustness in pairs, we can, just as we did in singles, we can calculate the combined entropy. That's trivial after we do the analytical entropy and again we do the contrast pair entropy, and I'll skip that for lack of time, and I'll just show you that, and again you get the inverse response. It's always the monkey, this is on pairs, this is on triplets, and you get the inverse response. The human amygdala is always richer than the human cingulate always richer than human amygdala, monkey cingulate than monkey amygdala, and human always than monkey. So if we combine the results and we put them all on the same axis, we get richness, which is number of maximal pairs with maximal contrast entropy in pairs, versus inverse robustness, so we get 1 minus the correlation. And what we get is a nice ordering of, this is the monkey amygdala, monkey cingulate, human amygdala, human cingulate, and they have what I think is a nice trend. This is empirical results. And if you think about this as the effective dimensionality of the network, because the number of pairwise correlations actually limit the dimensionality of the network and the richness actually allow it, so you get this, then what you find is that, this is just what I described in the scheme. You get less words in the monkey and in the amygdala, but more overlap, more words and less overlap in the human and in the cortex. And that is I would say, interpretation of the result. So if we now project this onto the effective dimensionality and take this as the number of dimensions, so there are a lot of work these days about how learning can be represented in high order manifolds and better learn. I mean, it's easier to learn obviously with high order manifolds and networks. And so if you look at the monkey amygdala cingulate, human amygdala cingulate, then it becomes pretty easy to see that we can learn more increased capacity just because the effective dimensionality of the network is higher. It also means that the desired learning will have a shorter path into being learned by this manifold, but it also means that an undesired learning, which is the balance with psychopathologies in my view, which also have a shorter and therefore will have less resistance to undesired learning, such as in the case of anxiety or post-trauma. This, of course, a two-step interpretation. Okay, so two people that did all the work I showed you here are Tamar and Raviv, and that's it. Thanks.